So thank you all for being here. I always start my talks with this quote. It's by Margaret Atwood: "A word after a word after a word is power," because I would argue that the same could be true. It's from her poem Spelling, by the way. I would argue that the same could be said about an image after an image after an image is power. So, you know, in the early 2000s, you might have been a young, recently graduated art student thumbing through a magazine and coming across two images side by side where that kind of present an idea of what we value in society and what we value those figures for, right? So here we have a scantily clad female figure, ejaculatory bottle of champagne, mouth agape, versus literally looking up at these fine young white men surrounded by books and awards, etc. This obviously has a very long history. We can look here to see how composition, this is for the students out there. I'm an educator, so it's part of it. So here, you know, we see this lightning bolt of a composition that this very wee man is sitting up on a horse, literally like kind of jutting off into the future, whereas the female figure, elongated, literally laying down, nothing to kind of like shield her from the world in any way. So early on, I started making work that was kind of about this: could we read the body language, could we dismantle, and could we complicate those kind of dynamics that were inherent within the images that we continue to come across? And so in a lot of ways, they became about this kind of sense of, I should say that this is also where I started using this notion of the poor as a kind of way to create almost like a dream space, a dreamscape. Like you weren't quite sure if this was like something she was fantasizing or if this was something that was like kind of a psychological landscape that she couldn't remove herself from. And so I purposefully kind of tried to make and shift the power dynamics a little bit by kind of obscuring certain parts or pulling out others. And always the female figure in these paintings had a kind of apathetic expression on their face, much like Buster Keaton would kind of like heighten the comedy of his works by having all of this kind of insanity happening around him, but he always has this like deadpan straight face. There was something about that I was trying to employ in these works where it would somewhat heighten the experience. And these are also very large scale paintings. This one's 6 by 8 feet. The previous one is like 8 by 12 feet or something like that. Then fast forward, like, I don't know, 10 years or something. I was given I was going on sabbatical, which in academia is like, an amazing time where you can kind of really start to dig deep and unpack some of the ideas you've been like just, flirting with. And so I had been painting myself for a very long time and I was really sick of that. And I knew that I wanted to plug into narratives that would be more universal in some way, that would oscillate between a kind of particular and universal narrative, which led me to Joseph Campbell's The Monomyth. But, Joseph Campbell, for all the amazingness that he was and kind of bringing certain structures and ideas and metaphors to life, didn't have very many female characters that he would cite. In fact, one student at Sarah Lawrence asked him, like, where are the female heroes? And he said, women don't need mythic heroes, they have babies. And so I think he was a product of his time. I don't I don't fault him necessarily. But it led me to kind of seek elsewhere for some other inspiration and kind of like different kind of thinking. And that led me to Marina Warner, who is a brilliant woman who wrote this book called From the Beast to the Blonde. And this was maybe in the 80s, I think she wrote this story. But for me, what was interesting is where she starts to kind of cite the earlier iterations of fairy tales, and that maybe the hero's journey for the female figure could kind of be found in some of what we have, the remains of these earlier versions, right? So for instance, in Red Riding Hood, in an earlier version called The Story of the Grandmother, she does this crazy striptease. She like drinks the blood and eats the body of her grandmother. This is all metaphor, obviously. And then at the end, she gets away of her own wit and cunning by saying she's got to go to the bathroom. Well, they didn't have bathrooms at this time, but you get my point. Rather than being either raped and murdered for making the wrong decision, a la the Charles Perrault version, or the Grimm's version where she's saved by a nearby father figure. Something else that Marina Warner cites in that text that I found really fascinating is this broadsheet that was going around in 1603, where it's literally highlighting all the places that women should not be allowed to gather. So they shouldn't be able to get together in the birthing bed, near the birthing bed, they shouldn't be able to get together at the bathhouse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea here, obviously, this thinly veiled insinuation is that women knew things, knew things that people who were kind of trying to control or exert power didn't want shared. So I started thinking about, well, is it possible then to start thinking about all of the images of art history where we see women gathering as a kind of subversive act? Maybe that's not for you, but I started thinking about it in a way where, is it even possible that you could hold these two things, i.e. the kind of feminism in the 1970s, where we're really thinking intensely about the male gaze, and also thinking about these women as having a certain amount of agency and what they were doing with the power that they had. So I started in kind of like an Angela Carter way, thinking more about what was happening internally, like what are some of the like kind of like, could I project some ideas of like some conversations taking place that might be this kind of progressive, movement forward. So I did several paintings like this. And then also part of that series, I was thinking a lot about movements and how fractured and uncomfortable they are, especially when they're really in like heightened kind of political climates. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you at all. Maybe we might be experiencing things like that over the last 10 years, I don't know. But so this woman, Candace Wheeler, was really fascinating to me because the suffrage movement was really, really complicated. There were a number of incredibly progressive women who did not necessarily believe that women should have the right to vote. I don't think Candace Wheeler was necessarily an anti-suffragist, but she definitely thought that the real path to freedom for women would happen through women being paid for their work and being paid, hopefully equally. So she's fascinating. She created a group of, it's called the Associated Artists, and she's the first woman to work with Tiffany. She's interesting. You should look her up. But anyway, I kind of wanted to weave her design, that was her design, by the way, into the paintings that I was creating where these women are kind of gathering and who knows what they're talking about. And so they're large scale. A lot of the images that I'm using as fodder for this kind of exploration are taken from boudoir paintings. Those are generally pretty small, like easel paintings that are meant to inspire in the bedroom. And so, but here I'm kind of trying to like have this gold leaf lick at the figures in a way, but also censor parts so that it like helps to hopefully divert our eyes to what's happening between the two. And so the painting that's on view upstairs was another iteration of this. It was taken from a Vouet painting, which I will get to here, where it's of Lot and his daughters. So you can see here, part of the questioning I had was like, what just happens if we just take away the baddie, like remove the bad guy? What remains for the two female figures that remain? And here, it's like we're not quite sure, whose hand is whose, or I should say that, and I think this is on the museum label, I always forget to talk about this, but Lot and his daughters has been talked about as this kind of like ultimate sacrifice and kind of, the women are often like framed as heroes or something, but a lot of scholars have also like suggested that perhaps it's just an apologist tale for incest, which is like kind of horrifying. And when you look at the kind of lineage of images that painters have kind of painted of Lot and his daughters, they are all kind of being, I don't know, like utilized or kind of like manipulated for their erotic content. And so when you understand what you're really looking at and like what this might be doing, it gets a little uncomfortable. So after this exhibition I had, that was at Inman Gallery in Houston, Texas, I was invited to do a project in a historic home. And I thought, this is amazing, because I wanted to see what it would be like to have these artworks kind of living amongst the time, like within the time period from which they would be painted. And so I created, when I did the research for this exhibition, and I went to try to find out anything about the women who lived or worked in the home, there was literally nothing. Everything was anecdotal evidence, and that was horrible, but also kind of became what the content of the show became about, right? So it was about this lack of access. So in some ways, I cropped each image in such a way that you will never know. We can't see their facial features. We can't kind of understand them much as we might long to. And also, I kind of like the idea of them kind of snubbing us. So there's that. And this is the first time, too, where I collaborated with a writer, and she wrote 4 fictional essays kind of in response to the same anecdotal evidence, two from women who would have been support staff. I think that's would be maybe the nice term now, and then 2 who would have like visited or lived in the home. And then I was invited to do a project at the Weatherspoon Museum, which became a little bit of a mini retrospective of that previous body of work that I just talked about. This is another series where I kind of like plucked the figures from the sidelines of familiar paintings, kind of just shining a spotlight on some of the like underrepresented or marginalized figures of those paintings. And then I knew that I would be doing a site-specific response as well. And it was 2015. We knew that there was a pretty big election coming up, and we would have the first female candidate of a major party line for the first time in history. I kind of thought it was going to go a little differently, but it didn't. But I obviously wanted to celebrate the suffrage history, because just not 45 minutes away from the museum is where the seedbed of the suffrage movement took place. It's the first place where the Women's Rights Convention took place in Seneca Falls in 1848. What I didn't know then, and I'm embarrassed to say I did not, is how influential the local communities were to this movement. So the Haudenosaunee and the Quakers, they both were communities where women had I don't know if it was equal voting rights, but they had voting rights. Women in the Haudenosaunee communities, they could own property. When women had children, they went and lived, it was like a matrilineal line. So really fascinating. So I made a body of work that was kind of continuing that idea of women gathering as a subversive act. They had these gorgeous prints of, let me just check the time, okay, women gathering silkworms. And so that kind of became not a backdrop, but like a jumping off point to explore, again, this idea of gathering, but also maybe storytelling, and storytelling as a form of activism. It seemed important at the time. So I showcased a series of paintings where the women are sharing tales with one another. And we're not focusing on the stories being told, we're focusing on the storytellers actually telling those stories, because I truly believe that this is a way forward, or at least part of the way. And so sitting in the center is Scheherazade, talking to her sister and saving her life and the life of all women by, through the use of this engaging tale from 1001 Arabian Nights. Several others that I won't go into here. This is also the first time I started thinking about what a feminist utopia might look like. I don't think it looks like this, but I was really curious about the idea. I think the first urge whenever thinking about an oppressive structure is to just remove the bad part, the thing that you think is the bad part, right? But that can't possibly be that can't possibly work. It can't be the way forward. But this was just a kind of exploration into that. I will say that men don't really factor into my work in representation any longer, but when they do, they're listening. So in some of these images, you can kind of see, like there's a male scribe, and there's a male figure here, obviously, the Sultan. So then this brings me to the Edward Hopper House Museum. I was invited to do a project there. I obviously knew immediately that I would want to do something with Hopper's women. What I didn't know was most of them, after he was married, were of one particular woman, this one. This is Jo Nivison Hopper, who was far more famous than Hopper was when they got together. She was showing with like Stuart Davis, Maurice Prendergast, Man Ray, among many others. She's actually how he got his big break. She was in an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, and she convinced the curator to put Edward Hopper in the show. And then they got married, and then his career went like this, and hers went like this. So, but look at these things. They're gorgeous. These are two little oil pochades. We don't have a lot of work left remaining of hers, because when she died, which was like maybe to the day, a year after he did, they gifted all of their work, both hers and his, to the Whitney. And I think the Whitney kind of quickly deaccessioned some of that work, or at least like placed it in hospitals and things like that. So unfortunately, what we have left are some small remaining things, but also things that were misattributed to Hopper. They would often paint side by side. He's very tall and she was very short. So you would think that that would kind of give it away, but you know, sometimes, who knows, people standing on hills and things. So what I did is I took that palette, which looks a little even more intensified here. It's very brash and uncomfortable and hard to look at. And I think people kind of described her personality like that. I think, you know, she's the reason he is who he is in our history, because she did all the cataloging and recording of his daily life, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, so I lined his boyhood home with her loud palette. And then I received permission to photograph in the apartment that they lived and worked in. It's now owned by NYU. You can visit it. It's on Washington Square Park. And so I had a student who was an actress and artist, much like Jo, pose as Jo, posing as Hopper's women. And so I just kind of liked these, like this kind of loose thread that kind of connected her to a contemporary realm, contemporary world. I don't think that Hopper was necessarily, a political painter, obviously, but there was this, he did this sketch of this woman here on the right in 1929. Edward and Josephine traveled to Charleston, South Carolina. In the countryside surrounding Charleston, Hopper encountered a woman standing in front of her cabin. Almost a quarter of a century later, Hopper painted this scene. So as far as I know, this is the only woman of color that Hopper painted. I could be wrong about that. And I haven't found any scholarship about it, but I imagine the urge to paint her so many years later had to do with the civil rights movement, though, again, I haven't been able to locate any scholarship on it. So in my show, I had one image of a figure from behind. And then this is the final image in the show that where I tried to kind of now move the gaze to the viewer, and the way she's holding her hand has a little bit more aggression to it than the New York movie that we're so familiar with. So then I'm moving on here to the Delaware Art Museum. I was invited to do a project with them. They boast the largest collection of pre-Raphaelites outside of the UK. They also have a huge collection of American illustration. And so the American illustration pathway is really fascinating to me, because this is one of the first kind of careers that was acceptable for women to, a creative career, I should say, where women could kind of enter into the fold before they got married, of course. But there's all these like really cool communes that emerged, like the Red Rose Girls, who vowed to never marry so they could always make their art. And then I was also, like, again, coming back to fairy tales a little bit, this Catherine Pyle, who is Howard Pyle's sister, she wrote all these amazing fairy tales and illustrated them, and they're like really diverse and from all over the globe, and there's lots of female protagonists, and I was like, oh, Disney ruined us. And then I was also really fascinated by the female women, like the female figures of the pre-Raphaelite era. Because women did not have access to study, oftentimes if women wanted to be an artist, they would have to model, because that would be a way that they could kind of learn from the artists that they were like kind of laying in front of. And so I really kind of latched onto that as an idea and found that really fascinating. Being a model at that time, an artist model at that time, was akin to being a prostitute. So it was a real sacrifice of social status to kind of do this for one's, pathway. And, we just had to kind of get the side eye from our parents for like studying art. But back then it was like, you are shaming everyone by doing this. So I think it was really bold and brave, and a lot of them did not have a very happy ending, unfortunately. But I wanted to kind of honor that and kind of like also think about these works as almost like a witch's brew. Like oftentimes my work is like, it's signaling this kind of hallucinatory space where trying to rewrite the narrative a little bit, or at least like just offer a different kind of like kink in the works where we kind of like maybe see a different narrative that doesn't necessarily fit so like compartmentalized into the one that we're familiar with from school. And still obviously exploring like painterly effects to kind of like signal that this is not a real space, obviously. You'll notice the compositional structures too are circular in nature. There's like, I'm trying to play with this lack of hierarchy to a certain extent. And included in both of the paintings are former students of mine, because I wanted to honor them and also kind of like point to, like I consider these artists peers. They're incredible artists. And Noku Kanyalanga, she's like blowing up, like her work's being collected all over Europe. She's just an amazing human being and painter. And so like I kind of like included them in the works as well. This just gives you an idea of scale. I also kept coming across all this Victorian flower language conversation in all of the research I was doing for this particular show. And so I had a group of women. There's this new popular kind of approach to making flowers out of cold porcelain. It's this really thin, translucent, really beautiful, lifelike clay, like kind of like Fimo, but like more moldable, and like it gets really rigid. And so I made some flowers, and I had some other women make some flowers. And so each of these bouquets, I was desperately trying to find an example of a bouquet that would have been sent from one woman to another woman that has something like, the crow flies at midnight or whatever, like something that would be like somehow progressive, or something that would allude to like an unacceptable relationship or something like that. But I couldn't find any real ones, although after the fact I have kind of found a couple. But I just made up fictitious ones. So you can see here, like alluding to, Circe's garden, or maybe they could kind of like cross time and space, and like forward or backwards from particular famous people or thinkers, etc. So I will fast forward through these. But that ended up turning into a really fun collaboration I did with a digital artist, a friend of mine, where we created an interactive Victorian flower language. So this is on the Detroit Institute of Arts. You would like walk up to a tablet and plug in a joke, a love letter, anything, and it would just like translate it into this big, beautiful, blooming, kind of spiraling bouquet. And that project has gone on to be shown in several other places, and we kind of turned it into something you can use on your phone, and anyway, it's kind of fun. I also kept coming across these super cool, like first edition texts that were, for instance, the first edition text of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. Now, this text in particular is fascinating because of the provenance. It was from a male suffrage supporter to a female anti-suffragist, and they were in the same family. And I just loved that this kind of gorgeous marbleized front, like these end papers or these front and back pieces of this book, become this visual marker of something that means something so completely different to two different people. And that's kind of like my jam, like the idea that like one image can mean something so completely different and say so much about power and how we move through the world. So I decided to make 6 by 8 foot marbled paper, as one would. And you can kind of see these. Can you see these being made? Yeah. I mean, you know how to everyone's probably seen marbled paper, but anyway, it's like just wants to keep playing. Okay, and so then on the surface of those marbled papers, I was reading a lot about Margaret Fuller, who is said to have inspired the suffrage movement. She was kind of often talked about as an oracle. She was hanging out with the transcendentalists. Like many people have suggested that she had probably the most brilliant mind in our country at that time. But she just was like a horrible speaker. Like no, like she just like crickets. Like nobody could get enlivened by her speeches. So she would have these like small groups. And anyway, I was thinking about that as like, oh no, she wasn't an oracle. She was a sibyl, excuse me. And so I love this idea of like the fates, or we oftentimes see women in threes. And so I played with this notion. I was like thinking like, who are my sibyls? Like who are my voices in the dark of like how to see a way forward. And so I was referencing her. I was referencing Octavia Butler. This is an installation view in a gallery, so you can kind of see that painting in a new context. And then I did a series of small watercolors of women reading, like just my favorite heroes, because again, it's this collapsing of like, it's this thing where you think it looks very passive, nothing's going on, but the act of reading and writing in and of itself is like a transportive, really active, engaging experience. So that, but also dreaming, right? And this is the body of work I made during the pandemic. There was a lot going on. We're all stuck at home. Very sleepy time. But in a really kind of flat-footed way, I was thinking too about the act of awakening, and awakening on multiple levels, right? Like the title of the exhibition was called Fluttering Still, because it felt like so much was happening socially and politically, and yet we were just caught and stuck. And I wanted to kind of capture that somehow. So yeah, I was thinking about awakening in terms of like, maybe that's sexually, maybe it's politically, maybe it's just women waking women up. It was what I was like, this is like really flat-footed, but let's do it, ladies, let's go. So looking through the lens of women who have kind of were it girls during their time, but have become kind of forgotten. Ethel Reed, who had kind of a tragic life story, but brilliant designer. So I like these kind of spiraling lenses that we're kind of forced to look to. Another favorite was Gerda Wegener, who is probably best known as the spouse of the person who had the first transsexual surgery in the Danish Girl. There was a movie, The Danish Girl. So she was the artist who was painting her partner. But she's got these like really adorable like pornographic images, which I also love. She was also like super well known. Like she was, I mean, making illustrations for what would be like the Vogue of our time, right? Like La Parisienne, or I don't know, I'm not gonna like butcher another magazine name, but like mostly European, French stuff. So that was that. And then I'm almost done. We're doing okay, yeah, okay. So then I did do, as Denis mentioned, I did a project for the Weatherspoon Art Museum. And the curator of the exhibition, Emily Stamey, who curated Gilded, she's amazing. She was like, you have carte blanche to do whatever you want, but I think you might want to do something about these two. So obviously the Cohn sisters, who are the reason the Weatherspoon exists. It was a women's college at the time, and there was just a small gallery, but these two kind of brilliant collectors, they donated a lot of works on paper. Now, they looked like this long past it was the time that it was in fashion, right? But they had this hanging in their dining room. So, you know, like, I like that, some secrets, right? Like something like, I love this juxtaposition. I love this image of them smoking in the woods. And these women, they lived in an apartment, the Marlborough Apartments in Baltimore, and they were not petite women, but they had so much of like, look at this hallway, like how could you even walk down this thing? And they were like just modernist hoarders. Like there's just, it's horror vacui. There's no space you can look that doesn't have like a modern masterpiece in it. Most of the paintings, obviously, and the sculpture went to the Baltimore Museum of Art. But the works that they have at the Weatherspoon, and one of the first gifts, were primarily of these lithographs that Matisse did. And what's interesting about these particular lithographs is that he made them when he was kind of escaping the war, not intentionally. He did want to serve, but he was too old. I think he was like in his 40s, maybe. So old. And he also had like health problems. So he was a no-go for the soldiers. So then he goes to the south of France and is like living in this like sun-dappled, like amazing, I guess like Mediterranean life. And there's a local American Hollywood film being made. And so this director is like just feeding him all these like nubile young actresses. So these feel different to me. Like Matisse is kind of known as this guy that has like the same model for like 16 years, and she's part of the family, and it's really like wholesome. But these feel a little different, if you ask me. So I made a giant wall drawing that kind of took all of those lithographs and just kind of like placed them on top of one another in a way that would kind of mitigate the objectification of the form, but would hopefully still kind of like retain this kind of seething sensuality that I think are kind of in those paintings. I mean, I wasn't interested in them necessarily for the Matisse story, but I was interested in them for like why the Cohn sisters would be interested in those works. And the Cohn sisters are just interesting in and of themselves. Like Claribel was one of the first generation of female doctors. She decided to continue to live in Germany during the war, a Jewish American woman living, it was kind of amazing. Etta is said to have had a relationship with Gertrude Stein, and we know this because Alice B. Toklas was super jealous anytime Etta's name came up. That's kind of the only way that we kind of think that happened. Also, like there were some allusions in a diary, but why no one recorded this stuff is so super sad. But anyway, so each of the paintings kind of embeds different parts of their collection. In a way that hopefully kind of tells the tale of what's happening here. Etta had a little bit of an awakening, both sexually and in terms of art. She was kind of the caretaker of the family, and her parents both died, and then she was kind of free to roam. They both decidedly never married, probably for obvious reasons for Etta. For Claribel, I think she just liked her independence, and they were both being funded by their brother's business, which was in Greensboro. It was the denim, I think it was like denim factories or something like that, textiles. But I was really interested in textiles. I think Matisse grew up in a family of textile. I don't know what they did, but that might have been like a link for them. But in each of my paintings anyway, I'm really trying to focus on the relationship between the figures while kind of, the reason I started kind of like overlaying these works are because of the hoarder situation in their apartment, but also there's a scene there's a comment in one of the texts I was reading where Etta basically is like, I'm like one of your harem girls, Matisse. And then there's this seemingly harem figure that she hung above her bed, which I just think is like so fun to kind of see like what she went to sleep at night looking at. This is from a Baltimore newspaper from a certain, I don't know what period it is. Anyway, I don't need to keep going. I could do like a whole hour on this one because it was like so deeply entrenched into my brain for so long. So I'll kind of fast forward because I want to get to the witch stuff. So anyway, I was invited to do a proposal for the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. And my preliminary research turned up to the first woman to ever be charged and murdered for witchcraft in the United States happened 0.2 miles from the museum. So of course I find that fascinating, and knew that I kind of wanted to do a project about that. Now, they have a lot of like kind of references, like it just sent me down this crazy rabbit hole looking for anything that had to do with kind of occult or women or magic or mysticism. But it also led me to start thinking about the political machinations maybe at work behind some of these like notions of the witch hunt. So there's this fascinating book called Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. She's a feminist Marxist who basically in these texts outlines how systemic power structures such as capitalism, organized religion, patriarchy. These are all like kind of emerging in a way that almost becomes like, what do I want to say here? That the witch hunts were a product of early capitalism, because women were a huge part of the resistance against some of these like imposing structures. We often think about capitalism as like a progressive, like enlightened new way of being, and I assume that's because we're living in it. But at the time, there was a lot of pushback, like a 200-year-long pushback against this ideology. But if we look at the unfolding, and she does a really amazing job of outlining this in her text, there was a real, like, decided kind of point at removing women, like devaluing the things that women had been associated with. So we have a distaff, we have, again, here's this idea of women gathering, not being safe. So there's also this text that comes out, and because we have this new technology called the, there's a way to kind of like get this out to multiple people quickly. And this is called the Malleus Maleficarum. It's maybe the most misogynist text ever written. I don't know, I haven't read all of the books, but I do think this is a really heinous, and as one scholar put it, it's a one-handed read, meaning it's very titillating, it's like very violent. There's a lot of like torture and what needs to be done to rid the world of these. And they're so vague too, like anybody could be a witch under the ways in which they kind of define what that means. And so there's also this real enforced effort to remove everything that women are kind of valued for in their community. So anything like where women are kind of part of like healing practices, so midwifery, now women can't practice midwifery because, oh, I forgot there was a plague right before this too. So peasants had more power than they ever did. And so wage labor, what she argues, I'm gonna speed this up. What she argues though is that wage labor, when the male body kind of leaves and goes and works on the land, that labor gets waged, but it's very clear and very important to note that women's labor did not get waged, even though they were literally making more labor every time they had a child. So anyway, obviously, this was happening in my head, and then there's like some horrible things happening politically, and so I was wanting to make work in response to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because obviously I personally think there's a real problem with that when women don't have autonomy over their own bodies. I was also really interested in why witchcraft seems to be having like a new huge resurgence in pop culture, and why this seems to kind of happen at certain like peak moments in kind of like political unrest. So anyway, I proposed to turn the museum into a witch's altar. I have not heard back yet on whether I'll be able to do this. I think it'd be really, really cool. But I did end up making a series of spell paintings. And what I find interesting too is some of the etymology of just the words themselves. Like fates means like to speak. So like literally just to speak. And a spell means to tell a story. So the show I'm doing right now, it's like, oh, it even goes back like 30,000 years. So anyway, I'm just gonna speed this up though so we can have some questions. But I made a series of spell paintings. So in witchcraft, I am learning, there's this thing called correspondences, where people will kind of like pull in all the energies of like crystals and herbs and moonlight and all these things. So I started pulling those into my paintings, and I worked with a professional witch, thank you very much, who wrote some spells for me to accompany the paintings. And then from there, I was invited to do a project for the Untitled Art Fair, and they wanted the aesthetic of this project that I did. But for this, then, I made a wall drawing that incorporated all of these medicinal herbs that could be used for reproductive care for women. And then on the surface of that drawing were 3 paintings hanging featuring maenads. I feel like we need some maenad energy. Maenads are like really cool, you guys. They like are pleasure driven, like pleasure seeking. They basically like just go out and get wasted in the woods all the time. They like leave their families behind, and supposedly because they're like followers of Bacchus, but I kind of feel like maybe Bacchus is a beard in this situation. And then they're also like ferocious, like they can tear a live animal limb from limb. Like, I'm a vegetarian, I do not like support that, but I just think we needed that energy. That's kind of what I wanted to summon personally. It's how I was feeling. So these are these paintings. And yeah, like I said, the wall drawing had, specifically from Hildegard von Bingen, because she's a sainted Catholic nun who was offering reproductive care and abortifacients to people, albeit during during year 10,000. How do you say like it's 1,000? Do you say like, anyway, okay.